Welcome to Inside Opt. We often, when we look at textbook optimization, look at problems in isolation. In the real world, though, we have repeated applications of the same kind of problem when we're running a business. And that changes the game fundamentally. We need to talk. Consider a repeated stochastic game. Say we are having 3 different kinds of investments where we can put our money. In the first investment, whatever we bet is at stake. We lose it all with 45% chance, but with 55% chance we double it. The second investment, for every dollar that we invest, we can gain 5 cents with 50% probability, but we lose 4 cents with another 50% probability. And in the third investment, for every dollar investment, we have the chance of winning 56 cents with 51% probability, but we also have a chance of losing 53 cents with 49% probability. Now the question is, how should we invest our money? And if we do that, we might say, okay, let's look at the expected gains that we get from all of these investments. All of them have positive expected value. The first one here, on average, makes us 10 cents for every dollar that we invest. The second one only makes us half a cent for every dollar invested, and the last one 2.6 cents for every dollar invested. So this is a very simple knapsack problem. The question is, where would you invest your money? Well, invest the $10,000 into instrument number 1. And then we have a good chance that we will double our money, and an expectation we would walk away with $11,000 after 1 week. So the idea is that these investments run these odds after 1 week. Now we repeat this game for 2 years, 104 weeks. Now if we want to optimize our expected gains, it is still correct that we should be investing into instrument number 1, because every single time that we do that, we double our money and we have higher odds of winning than of losing. If we do that, our expected gains at the end, our expected end budget would be over $200 million. But there is only one way to actually make money, and that is for 104 times to double the money. So we either walk away with more money than God, or we walk away with bankrupt. And that is not acceptable in a business environment. What we need is we need to control for the risk that is involved. Because once we lose our investment, we have nothing else to invest anymore, and that means we can't move forward. You see on the right-hand side here is what you would get from a stochastic optimizer like Seeker, which also controls the odds that we might be losing some of our initially invested budget. And what you see here is a typical curve that you would get from such an investment. And now this is an important thing to note. Whenever you have an optimization problem, whether it's a repeated optimization problem or not, whenever you have an optimization problem and the inputs are estimates. Think, for example, what is the demand for product at a certain price? Or think, what are going to be the travel times tomorrow when my truck needs to go and visit clients? These are estimates, what the travel times are, what the price sensitivity is. And that means no matter how you arrive at your strategy, no matter how you decide what you need to fix today, that's what optimization does. No matter how you do that, you're going to end up with a variety of potential outcomes that you would be looking at. This is typically what we get to with sensitivity analysis. We might be running a couple of scenarios, 2, 3, 4, 5 scenarios in order to get an idea of, well, how would our profits, how would our constraints, how would all the different KPIs that we are interested in with respect to our business evolve if we were facing different scenarios. And now what you see here in this slide, this density curve, tells you essentially how likely it is that a particular outcome could happen. So here you see that the outcomes vary somewhere between $1,000 and $55,000, something like that. Or maybe it's $4,000 and $55,000, something like this, yeah. And you also see that there's a big peak here around $18,000. And you can also look at the area under the curve to get an idea of what is the joint probability that I might be looking at a result that, for example, that I might be making less than $20,000. And that's maybe 60% or so of the area that you find under here. And that would mean that with 60% probability, you're not going to more than double your original budget after those 2 years. But with 40% probability, you would. And this is what these densities give you. So rather than just probing 3, 4, 5 points of individual scenarios, this stochastic optimizer here, Seeker, would actually give you the whole distribution. And again, you get such a distribution for any problem where the inputs are estimates. It's very important to remember. And now there is a debate that is currently going on in the optimization community. If you have these repeated games where, again, we do not know how the situation is going to evolve, either during the day when we're executing or what other problem we're going to look at tomorrow, whether we can actually cope using deterministic optimization and how much it costs us to do that as opposed to using stochastic optimization. And this is what we're trying to get to today in this study, to try and understand how much does it cost me if I'm trying to approach repeated stochastic optimization problems using deterministic optimization. To assess the value of stochastic optimization in repeated stochastic optimization problems, we will look at a number of different situations when we might want to use it. So concrete problems, concrete data, and concrete outcomes. Here's a client, they run a ticket system. Tickets come in, they need to be worked on, and they don't work on these tickets in a block, but throughout the day. And there's a certain number of tickets in the system in the morning that gets distributed among 30 workers. And then the workers start working on their assignments, and they switch between them. So they really need to know them. Plus, we do not really want to redistribute those that have been assigned before. Now, there are 10 different kinds of tickets that have a different difficulty attached to them. A nominal time that you usually, an average worker would need in order to close one of those tickets. And that depends on the type of the ticket and what the time t is. Now, of course, these individual tickets vary in difficulty as well. So we're assuming here a variance of 10% following a gamma with scale t over 10 and shape 10. Now, the number of tickets of each type follows a Poisson distribution. So we know what the number of tickets in the system is today, but we do not quite know how long it's going to take us to work on every single one of them, but we have an idea. And we do not know how many tickets we're going to get of what type tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. Now, each worker individually is also good with different types of those tickets, so even their efficiency kind of varies, and we know how. We have historical data on how good they are. So some of them, if the nominal time of a ticket was, say, an hour, can handle it in 50 minutes, and somebody else might need an hour and 10. Now, what we want to minimize here is the spill. So all of the 30 workers are working 8 hours per day. And what we don't want is that somebody who started working on a ticket today gets that ticket carried over into the next day, where it takes away time from them to do that. Now the question is, how would we approach such a problem? Well, if you come into it with a mindset of a optimizer, you might think of, well, let's maximize the buffer that every one of our workers has at the end of the day by minimizing the make span. So the person that is done with their tickets the latest should have an early call, an early end of day, as much as possible. So we take the make span z here. We're trying to minimize that. Z is greater or equal, of course, all the time that every single worker needs. So this is for every W. And the time that the worker needs, well, that depends on what tasks get assigned to them. So the tasks here are called P for project that are assigned to worker W times the time that this worker actually needs for this particular thing. And we can take the nominal time, multiply that with the efficiency of the worker for this particular type of project. And then, of course, we have binary variables XPW that sum to 1 for all tasks, so meaning every project gets assigned to exactly one worker. And, of course, our times here are greater or equal 0, and these assignments are 0, 1. This is one way of formulating the problem. And we will contrast it with a stochastic version of the problem, where we take into account that we do not exactly know how long or how difficult these tasks actually are and how long the worker is actually going to need to do this. So rather than saying, well, let's minimize the make span, we're going to minimize 2 times the expected time plus the CVAR 10% of the spill, right? So we're going to compute the spill, total time that is going to spill into the next day, and take 2 times that expected value plus the CVAR. Why 2 times? Well, because the CVAR 10% is typically larger than the expected time, the expected spill, well, because it's the worst 10%. And we're trying to get them kind of on even paring, so we multiply the expected with a factor of 2. Now, the spill is the total time that the workers are over their 8-hour shift, which means that this TW here is the maximum of 0 of the time that they're actually needing minus 8 hours. Right, so whatever they're over the 8 hours, that is what would be there. And of course, that depends now on the actual time. So this here now is no longer a deterministic value, the time that is there, but it's actually a stochastic value. It's a distribution. And the rest of the model is exactly the same. So we have to assign every project to one worker. And then, of course, our spill and the times are greater or equal 0, and the assignments is 0 and 1. Now, if we run this every single day, note that we are not doing a look ahead with the arrival times of new problems the next day or so. No, the only stochasticity that we're actually taking into account here in this comparison is how long is it actually going to take today and how much overtime are we creating today. And we are not just going for minimizing the expected time, but we're also trying to minimize the risk that we're going to have much spill. The only difference. And this is what you're going to get. So what does this table actually tell us? Well, this is the mean hours of spill we're going to get if we use this min-make span formulation. It's after 5 days, we would end up with a total spill. So every time that we get spill for every single day, we add that for every day, 166 hours. If we use the stochastic formulation, we're down to 141 hours. And that's a difference of 17.6%. So it's 17% more efficient to use the stochastic assignment procedure than to use the deterministic one. I also give you the CVAR here, and you see that, of course, in the tail it's even more pronounced. I also give you the time, the spill that you're going to have on the 5th day. So kind of how much goes into Saturday, if you want. And that is, if you use the deterministic version, is 40 hours, whereas for the stochastic version is only 32 hours. So it's 27% less, 1/4 less of overtime that of spill that you have at the end of the week if you're using the stochastic optimization. And this is the corresponding curve, by the way, for the spill of Friday into Saturday, so after day 5. And you see here that the probability of the stochastic version shifts to the left, right? So it shifts everything towards lower amounts of spill with higher probability, which of course drives down the expected value and also the CVAR in the tail. You see that this is more pronounced here because you know, if you're not doing well on day number 1 and then you're not doing as well on day number 2 and so on, that really accumulates because it takes away from the amount of work that you can do the next day. And by the way, I should have mentioned that here, when I do this -8, well, if I come into a day where this worker has spilled from yesterday, of course, that gets subtracted from that 8 as well. So it's the available hours that they have for tickets of that day that will be put in there. Okay, so this is the formulation for Monday. For Tuesday, we would have to subtract whatever that worker gets of spill from yesterday from these 8 hours. So that was our first example. Second example, production planning. Say we have a supermarket and we have 2 different kinds of sushi dishes, and we have a typical production planning problem. So you see here that when we're deciding the quantities that we're going to produce of each kind of dish, there are limited production capabilities, limited amounts of workers, limited machines, limited ingredients. Okay, so you can't produce arbitrary amounts of sushi dishes. Now the question is, how many of them are we going to sell? Well, we're certainly not going to sell more than what we produced. Okay, that's number one. And then the second one is the demand. And here we're assuming that the demand is an estimate. We're thinking that at the price that we're taking for these sushi dishes, we're going to get 7,000 of them sold. But there's some noise around it, and we're not quite sure how much that is actually going to be. And the same thing for sushi dish number 2. We're not going to sell more than what we produced. And for sushi dish number 2, we think that there is a market of selling 10,500. But again, we are not 100% sure that we will really be able to sell 10,500. Or maybe it's 11,500, or maybe it's only just 9,000. The problem now is that if we have sushi dishes left over, the fish doesn't want to carry for too long, we get excess, and then we have to throw away the dishes. And out of a marginal profit that you're making for each dish, so sushi dish number 1 gives you 30 cents in profit, 45 cents for sushi dish number 2, but it costs money to produce this thing. And if we have excess and we have to throw them away, now suddenly we're losing everything that we put into that product. So we're not making profit, we're actually making a big loss on those dishes. We do not want to have too much excess on E2, obviously. Okay, now, this is a problem that we need to do every single day. The thing is that here isn't actually much crosstalk because the sushi dishes will be thrown away for the next period, right? So say we do this per week, and after a week we have to throw away these sushi dishes. So there isn't really any spillover, but we still have to solve this problem on a weekly basis. And we do not quite know what the demand is going to be. Now let's look at it. What are the results if we compare a deterministic formulation where we assume that 7,000, 10,500 is set in stone versus when we assume that the demand that we have for each dish is stochastic? And we're looking at 2 very, very different noise distributions for the demand. On the left-hand side here, we're looking at normal noise around the demand. That is here, right? So you see a normal noise with standard deviation 10%. And on the right-hand side, you have a negative exponential. Again, the noise factor here would be on expectation also 1. So the expected value is always going to be 7,000, 10,500. And the standard deviation is going to be 10% in both cases. But of course, the way how the noise affects the true demand is very, very different. Right? You will hopefully agree that this distribution looks tremendously different from this one over here. Now, if we optimize this with Seeker, we would get an expected profit of 5,550 roughly, whereas if we use the deterministic version, we would only get 3,756. And in the 10% quantile, this is much more pronounced. The predict and optimize would actually lose $2,200, whereas the stochastic solution still gives us over 5,000. For this noise distribution, we get a different solution, obviously. Here, the mean profit would be 5,100 roughly, whereas PTO is at 3,900, 24% less than what you get with the stochastic optimization. And in the quantile, again, it's much, much more pronounced. But now look at the solutions. Predict and optimize. If you assume that the 7,000, 10,500 was set in stone, would suggest, well, produce 6,000 of dish number 1 and 10,500 of dish number 2. And that is regardless of the noise distribution, obviously, because, well, it is not aware, right? The deterministic optimization is not aware of any noise. It assumes that 7,000, 10,500 watts is there in demand, and it acts accordingly. But now look at the different solutions that you're going to get from the stochastic optimization under these very different noise distributions. They're almost the same. Right? You're going to increase a little bit compared to the MIP solution here. You're going to increase a little bit sushi dish number 1, not too much, between 100, 150 or so more. You're greatly going to reduce the stochastic dish number, the sushi dish number 2. Somewhere between, around 8,800 or something like this. These two solutions, even though these noise distributions are very, very different, are almost the same. And under those distributions, you get massively better results than with the deterministic solution. Between 24 and 33% more in mean profit that you're making using the stochastic optimization. Another example. Now we're talking about pricing and distribution. And this is an example that was put forward by one of our competitors, Gurobi, who of course do this with deterministic optimization because they sell a MIP solver. What you have to do is you have a certain production of avocados that arrives every week, and you have to distribute them to, I think it's 7 different or 8 different areas in the United States, and you have to give a certain amount of avocados to each of these regions and set the prices there. And the question is, how do you set the prices and how many avocados are you going to send? And this is a weekly recurring problem that you have. The avocados that you don't sell, again, go bad. Now, this is a typical solution that you would get from your MIP formulation of this problem, which is really straightforward, so it's not worth actually writing the MIP down. We will put links to those collabs that we're having for the examples that are given here, so you can familiarize yourself with the particular models here. But the point is, the solution always looks something like this here. For each region, a MIP solver will set the price and the number in millions of avocados that will be sent over there. And then it will tell me, well, how many of them do I think I'm going to sell? How many of them are going to be wasted? So they're going to go bad. And that means, that should be less than the predicted demand. But the MIP solver here takes the predicted demand as if it were set in stone. So see what happens here. It basically allocates 3.44 million and then thinks I'm going to sell 3.44 million because that is my predicted demand and there's not going to be any waste. So the solver doesn't account for the fact that, of course, that was an estimate, 3.44 million. Sometimes you could have sold more avocados and sometimes you will sell less. So an expectation, you're going to have waste there, even though the predicted demand is greater or equal the number that you allocated. Okay? And you see here that they have too many avocados here for the prices that they want to take, and they're all sending them to Mid-South, in this case because the transportation to the Mid-South is the cheapest. So whatever they're thinking they're going to waste is sent to one area. And that means you're not preparing at all for the fact that sometimes your demand estimate was low, meaning you don't have any excess assigned to any of the other regions, allowing you to pick up much more business because you sent it all to one region where all these avocados are going to go bad. These are obviously, if you're looking at these solutions, these are obviously bad solutions. Nevertheless, they have been put forward by the competitor as what you ought to be doing, and this is what you regularly hear from optimization experts. So let's do something a little bit more reasonable. When we try to estimate what is the total number of avocados that will be sold in a particular region, the data looks something like this over here, right? So if you compare the actual demand with the real demand, you're close to the main diagonal over here, but you're never really on it. And you can, of course, compute for your data set, for your machine learning data set that makes this demand forecast, what its average error is. So, for example, you could look at the mean absolute percent error that you're making, and it's something like 23%. So this is not minuscule that you're going to be off with your demand estimates, even though on average you would assume that this is roughly okay. The mean error that you're going to make is 23%. And now, here's the next thing that I want to highlight. If we're taking the deterministic model of allocating the avocados, so how much we distribute to each area and what price we're going to take, and turn it into a stochastic model, there are only two lines that we need to add to this problem. The first one is when we compute the demand, we're not going to just take it from this linear regression over here and turn it directly into the demand that we have, but we put a stochastic value, a stochastic multiplier with standard deviation 23%, which we took from this MAPE over here, and multiplied there. So that makes the demand a stochastic value now. And that means the sales and the profit and everything else is going to be stochastic now as well. And that means that before we maximize our profit, we need to take a statistic over that result. So remember what I was saying in the beginning. No matter what you do, no matter how you allocate your avocados and how you sell your prices, depending on what the true demand actually is, which you will only know after the week, right? So you can only observe this in hindsight, the results will vary. And that means you're going to get a curve, you're going to get a distribution for your profit. And that is exactly what you see in the model here as well. So if you're stochastic, it means you need to take a statistic of that outcome distribution and decide what you want to optimize for. What we just did in the first example was to take 2 times the expected plus CVA 10%. Here we're just going to go for the average profit that we're going to make. All right? And those are the only 2 things that you need to change in a Sequential model to go from a deterministic version of the problem to a stochastic version of the problem. Very, very simple. And what do you get if you do that? Well, if you run this thing with Gurobi, the MIP solver, you're going to get, well, it believes that it's going to make 34.34 million per week. But in reality, if you actually simulate the historical errors that you have in the demand forecast, you would end up with something like 32.9 million per week. So it's significantly less than what was assumed here. It's about 1.5 million per week less than what Gurobi thinks it's going to make versus what it actually makes with this assignment. And you've seen such an assignment before when I showed it to you, where they distribute all the excess avocados to the Mid-South, etc. And here's the stochastic version. So here we take into account that our demand forecast actually comes with error bars, right? So there's a 20% deviation left and right. And if you now optimize with that stochasticity in mind, by the way, this doesn't take forever. It's just a 1 second run on one core using 500 scenarios, using the free version of Seeker, which you get on the Google Colab. It believes it's going to make 33.2 million per week, and in reality, it's actually making 33.86 million per week. So you're getting awfully close now to what Gurobi actually thought it was going to make, but you're making $1 million more every single week for the sole reason that you took the distribution, the uncertainty in the demand forecast into account when you were optimizing. $1 million per week. And now you might say, well, 34 over 33, this is in percent, this isn't that much. True, but this is revenue. So I don't know how much it actually costs them to provide these avocados and whether this isn't all profit. But what you just added is pure profit. So if the true value is maybe you're making 14 million instead of 13 million, now you're actually talking the percentages that you're driving your profit up. And that is not a measly 3% or something like this. This is something like 7 to 10% or so that you're going to make in additional profit. Very, very significant savings. The next example, what happens if I have correlated products? I mean, if I have an avocado, okay, so I have a price sensitivity, but if I have a whole store, different products interact with one another. Now what? So, for example, in this little convenience store, I have milk, I have a high margin chocolate that I sell, and then I have 2 competing products, soup and ramen, which is like convenience food that people buy for themselves. There's a certain cost There's a certain range that I can buy to put it in there, and there's a price range that I've been given where I have a reasonable idea of how much the whole thing is actually going to cost. Then there is a residual value, of course. If I don't sell this thing this week, how much is it worth next week? The milk is going to go bad, so it's going to be out of the window, and the chocolate and everything else loses a little bit of value. Whereby for the soup, there's a certain amount of the units, the soup units that I have that are going to go bad. So I need to get rid of them this week. And now the question is, well, how should I account for this? Well, if I run this, again, using on one hand a deterministic MIP model, or on the other hand, taking the uncertainty in our demand forecasts into account, then you see this result. The deterministic solver, the MIP solver, will think that it's going to make $2,539 $2,539 in profit. In reality, under the uncertainty of the demand forecast, it's only going to make $2,234. So, and this difference here, this is really the reason why the deterministic solver doesn't do so well. The objective function that any optimizer uses is supposed to guide it towards those solutions that are actually better. If my assessment on how good a solution is 14% off, you cannot really expect this thing to find the optimum, right? I mean, it doesn't have the resolution to do so. The stochastic solver, on the other hand, assumes that it's roughly worth 2,360, and in reality, it's worth a little bit more. As less than 0.1% off of what it actually is, using 500 scenarios. The improvement here from 2,234 to 2,365 doesn't sound earth-shattering. It's 5.5%. Then again, in retail, 5% more profit, and this is pure profit, is an incredible amount of money. So again, very significant savings. Now you might ask, well, yeah, but what do I do with these correlations that I have over there, right? So my milk is a staple that drives traffic into the store. If it's cheap or if it's very expensive, people look at the price of the milk and they go like, nah, I'm not going to buy the milk here, and they're going to go to the next store. So then you're not going to sell your high margin chocolate either. And then you have those competing products, the ramen and the soup. And so you have to take that into account as well. So how do you get that? Well, what you do is you build a joint forecasting model, and then you're actually looking at you could also do individual linear regressions. That's fine. This is actually how we did it in this case. So you do a log-log transform, because if you lower the price by 1%, you're assuming that the demand is going to go up by something proportional to 1%. Right? So you do a log-log transform, you do a linear regression for that thing, but now you're going to get residual values. So if you run this through a cross-validation, say a 10-fold cross-validation, every one of your training examples was now one time in the validation set. And that means that training example now comes with a joint vector of how the demand for the milk at the current prices, how the demand of the milk, how the demand for the ramen, the soup, and the chocolate varied. And that allows you to build a covariance matrix over those residuals. So every single time that an example is in the validation set, you get a vector that tells you, this is how much I would be earning using my current individual forecast for these linear regressions after the log-log transform. And you can use this covariance matrix in order to put noise, joint noise, over all your individual demand forecasts. This is actually how we're doing this here in the stochasticity. It's very, very simple to do. It's literally 3 lines in Python using the standard scikit-learn functions that are there for you. Very, very easy to do, and you don't need anything sophisticated in actually to arrive at these posterior distributions of your joint demand forecast. Next example, routing. So assume that you live in home number 0 and you need to get to the airport, and you have exactly 95 minutes in order to get there to catch your flight. So you were procrastinating. if you make it in less than 86 minutes or lower equals 86 minutes, you can do the long-term parking. If you need to go on the short-term parking, then it costs you $80. If you miss the flight, well, you went with a super saver, so you miss it, you lose it. You have to buy a different ticket that's going to cost you $600. So the question now is, well, how do you get there? Well, you have the estimates on how long it takes to go on each of these edges. But they're estimates. You don't know that it's really going to take you 22 minutes to get from 0 to 1 or 20 minutes to go from 0 to 2. Let me make this bigger for you so you can actually see this. So what would you be doing? Well, the important point here is that if you go the shortest route, which is, for example, you go from 0 to 2 to 6 to 9 to 11 to 12, which gives you an overall 90-minute expected value. Yeah. So likely you won't be making the short-term parking, but you will make your flight if you take this route. Fine, you can do that, but see that you're really putting yourself out of options. So if you go from 2 to 6, and now anything happens here on the edges from 6 to 9, 9 to 11, or 11 to 12, you're screwed. You're stuck. You only have that one route, and you can't reroute yourself. So the repeated game here is that whenever you get to a new node, you get to decide again where you want to go. And the travel times might have updated in the meantime, and now you can react to that. So now if I do this, and the deterministic forecast is very simple, well, you take the shortest route in the beginning, right? So take the edge that belongs to the shortest route. Fine. Then you observe what the new times are, compute the shortest route again, and take that one, right? So that's the deterministic version. The stochastic version puts a distribution around these travel times, and then computes what is the lowest expected node that I should be going to from where I'm actually going to have the least costs to go there. And if I do that, the results are massively better. So the expected time goes down by about 5% if you use the stochastic version. And the costs go down by 67%. Well, that is because you have this very nonlinear cliff where at some point you can't make the long-term parking anymore. You have to go on short-term parking, and then you have the cliff for the flight itself that you're going to lose. So very, very significant results here on the stochastic look ahead when it comes to routing. And then finally, the standard problem that people look at when it comes to repeated stochastic games, inventory replenishment. We have uncertainty on how much will actually be needed of each product, and you have uncertainty on when a product will actually arrive. So you have uncertainty both on the supply and on the demand side. And what I give you here is like 5 intermittent items that we have. We told them, hey, we are looking for fill rate of something like 87.5% or so. So around 87% we want to lie, minimize my inventory costs. And what you get, I mean, here you can't do this deterministically. You have to do something with safety stocks. But typically safety stocks are being computed using aggregate statistics. So you take something like, z-score times the standard deviation of your demand forecast within the lead time, right? That would be a typical way of doing this. And that's exactly what we're comparing with. And what you see here is that when you then evaluate it under stochasticity for realistic demands that might actually be hitting these items, you get typically a higher fill rate than what you needed, right? So we were told, hey, minimize your inventory while keeping the fill rate above 87%. And what you see here is that, well, I give this an orange here, but, Sika has the same problem for this item number 3, but it's in the right ballpark, right? So it's around 87%. But see how much more inventory the aggregate statistic that you're just putting in there and then deterministically solve the problem, rather than have a stochastic scenario-based optimization in the background. The inventory is much lower. And the gains here are anywhere from 3% to 33% in inventory that you're going to get Again, this is an evaluation here for 1,000 different scenarios that we're using over here in order to assess how good this is. So this is realistic that the result would actually be, 1/3 less inventory that you need if you use the stochastic optimization versus the aggregate statistic deterministic optimization. So how important is stochastic optimization? If you look at this table here, you get a complete overview. And you see that our gains are anywhere, so it depends on whether you're minimizing or maximizing, whether minus or plus is good. So on the assignment problem, right, the ticket system that we talked about first, we went from 166 hours of spill to 141 hours of spill. And that gave us a 15 to 25% improvement in terms of total spill over 5 days versus last day spill. Production scheduling. The question of what do we do with our sushi dishes went from $3,850 to $5,100 or $5,085 plus 32% in profit. Pricing and distribution, the avocados. Now we don't know exactly because we are affecting profit here directly, whether this is, 34 over 33 or whether this is more like a 14 over 13 improvement. But it's somewhere between 3% in revenue and 10% or so in profit that we're improving here. $1 million per week, right? So it's really big numbers. Then the replenishment and pricing problem that we were talking about. So that's a supermarket with the ramen, the milk and whatnot. Joint distributions, 5.6% improved profit. And then the routing, instead of having cost of $239, we went down to cost of $143. It's a 5% reduction in travel time and a 40% reduction in cost. And then finally, the replenishment problem that we were looking at in inventory for these 5 intermittent items that we had in our warehouse, we went from on average 60.8 units down to 53.8 units, or a reduction in 13%. And here you have 6 examples where we have repeated optimization problems that we need to solve, and how much stochastic optimization actually gives you. The gains range anywhere from 5 to 40%. It's not clear a priori how much you're going to make, but in each one of these examples, the gains are very, very significant. And why does a 5% gain matter? Well, because it actually holds up under the stochasticity. We properly assessed how well it's going to do under the stochasticity, whereas a 5% gain on a, on the optimality of a point prediction is worth absolutely nothing. A 5% on a stochastically assessed solution is worth a lot. Why? Well, because we saw that before, a deterministic solver is sometimes 14-15% off in its assessment on how well the solution actually is. So they are trying to get to something that's provably optimal is completely useless, because your assessment of reality is wrong. But if your assessment of reality is something like 0.1%, now 5% are 5% that you're actually making more and that are truly materializing for your business. And that is why stochastic optimization matters so much. So let us close with the typical myth that people like to distribute and misinform you about on why you should not be caring about stochastic optimization. Typically, the mantra goes as follows. We cannot accurately estimate the uncertainty, so it's best to ignore it. Well, if you follow that line of argument, then 0 should be your estimate for absolutely anything that you can't know 100% accurately. Let me say that again. If somebody tells you, well, I don't know what my uncertainty is, so I'll assume it's 0. The variance is 0. I'll just take my point estimate. Well, what they're saying is that if I don't know what a value is, then 0 is the correct value for it. That's obviously nonsense. You know that there is uncertainty. You can see it in the machine learning. When you build those estimates, you see that there were errors there, and you can use them to estimate it. So that's gives us directly point number 2. We have no good ways for estimating the uncertainty. This is going to be a huge project for my machine learning team. I don't want that. Well, that's nonsense. It's very, very simple. You can either use the error rates, which your machine learning team already has, or use something like the covariances of the residuals, which your machine learning team also has. So even if they're not using a forecasting model that by itself comes with a posterior distribution, many of them do, by the way, but even if that is not the case, you can very easily build a posterior distribution around it. Okay, then point number 3, but we cannot estimate really the posterior distributions. We don't know what the shape is going to be. Why do we bother with the whole thing at all? Well, remember what I showed you in the beginning with the sushi dishes with those 2 very, very different noise estimations, and that you actually ended up with two solutions, 2 decisions that are almost identical. You do not need to know the shape of your posterior distribution. What you need is that your posterior distribution properly, not super accurately, but properly covers the potential futures that you might have to prepare for. So even a crude estimate of the variance is better than point estimates. It gives you much more resilient solutions and in practice, much better results. Now, a solution optimal for point estimate will also perform well in reality. That's the next thing you hear from people, right? So they go like, stochastic optimization is such a superfluous complication, because if something performs really well, provably optimal for my point estimates, then surely it will also do well for whatever hits me. And that's complete nonsense, as you just saw. The results that you just saw, and those are the true assessments of the results, range anywhere from 5 to 30% suboptimality. It is millions that you're burning through by going through, by using deterministic optimization instead of stochastic optimization. And then the last myth that you're then eventually being hit at your head is that stochastic optimization is just too hard. We don't want to bother. It's too complicated. We can't. Well, you saw it. 2 lines of code transform a deterministic model into a stochastic one. And then if you use a solver like Seeker, you can use distributed computing, because that is completely different in deterministic optimization, MIP optimization, where throwing more cores at the problem might actually deteriorate your performance as opposed to improving it. A solver like Seeker greatly benefits from more cores that you can assign to it, so you can throw compute at your problem, and the complexity can be handled. The solver is super efficient in building surrogates for potential futures, for assessing what the true value is actually going to be. And there you have it. Stochastic optimization is not an academic exercise. It is not hard to do. You can easily get the uncertainties. You don't have to worry about getting them completely right, and you can expect massively better results for your business if you're using it. And that's why we needed to talk today. Thank you.